May privilege speech ngayon si Senadora Risa Hontiveroz. Panoorin po natin.
Immune from deterrence to the uninhibited discharge of their legislative duties, not for their private indulgence, but for the public good. The privilege would be of little value if they could be subjected to the cost and inconvenience and distractions of a trial upon a conclusion of the pleader, or to the hazard of a judgment against them based upon a judge's speculation as to the motives. Close quote. I am calling on my colleagues in the Senate, Mr. President. Perhaps it is due time to review provisions of law, both in the Constitution and in the revised Penal Code, on parliamentary immunities and privileges, and our right, as well as the right of the people we represent, to be protected from these baseless suits. Opposition legislators voted by the people are charged on the flimsiest of evidence. Criminal cases are being used as weapons by the executive against the legislature. Let me spell out why the behavior of the Justice Secretary is so unethical, Mr. President, and so unbecoming a member of the civil service. Here is the Secretary of Justice, the head of the principal law agency of government, and whose functions include the prosecution of offenders. He has supervision and control over prosecutors who conduct preliminary investigations to determine whether or not there is probable cause against an accused. Kung sa simpleng lengguwahe ng kalye, ang opisina niya ang nagpapasya kung tutuluyan ang kaso laban sa akusado. Anyone with that kind of power must hold himself to the highest standard of impartiality. But this is apparently not important to the good secretary. Siya po'y nakikipagkuntsabahan sa isang grupo para magsampa ng kaso. Kaso na opisina din niya ang magpapasya kung may probable cause o wala. There are no words, Mr. President, for this kind of lutong Macau. There are no words. Mr. President, hindi na bago sa atin ang kapalpakan ng Secretary of Justice. Hindi ba siya din ang nagkalat nung kasagsagan ng pagbomba ng Marawi na sina Senator Bam at Senator Sani Trillanes ay nagpunta sa Marawi at nakapagpulong sa mga sangkot sa siege? Hindi ba opisina niya ang nag-downgrade ng kaso ng mga pulis na pumaslang kay Albuera Mayor Rolando Espinosa? Hindi ba siya ang nakipagkita kay Jack Lam sa isang hotel sa The Fort, bagamat si Jack Lam ay may mga hinaharap na kasong nakahain at iniimbestigahan? All these lead me to the conclusion, Mr. President, that there is no other respectable option but to call on the Justice Secretary to resign. He is in violation of Republic Act 6713 or the Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards for Public Officials and Employees. To quote Section 4B of the said law, public officials and employees shall perform and discharge their duties with the highest degree of excellence, professionalism, intelligence, and skill. They shall enter public service with utmost devotion and dedication to duty. They shall endeavor to discourage wrong perceptions of their roles as dispensers or peddlers of undue patronage. Secretary Aguirre undermines our justice system, and his continued stay in office is a vulgar insult to the Filipino people and our efforts for a more just society. Further, Mr. President, we must not allow attempts to thwart or diminish our constitutionally guaranteed right to parliamentary immunity. No legislator must be threatened with arrest or imprisonment for acts which she or he believes in good faith to be within the realm of functions reposed in her or him by the Constitution. It is time we revisit the concept of parliamentary immunity from arrest to ensure that a legislator cannot be prevented from attending to her or his duty as a member of Congress. While there are indeed constitutional safeguards available to an accused by the Constitution, and while these safeguards may constitute an obstacle to overreach and abuse of power by the prosecuting arm of the government, recent events have caused our reliance on such assurance to become irresolute. While the rights of an individual under the Constitution are vast, we need to examine whether these are adequate. If found wanting, then it is our duty to craft the appropriate measures to fill the gap. Given, Mr. President, that at the heart of this issue I bring before the Senate is the ethical conduct of a government official, and considering that I am seeking the review of our constitutional provisions on parliamentary immunity, I am respectfully moving to refer my speech to the committees on civil service primarily and to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Codes secondarily. Marami pong salamat, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may we recognize the Minority Leader to interpolate?
The Senate Minority Leader, Franklin Dillon, is recognized.
Just a few questions, Mr. President, if the lady will yield the floor.
Very gladly, Mr. President.
Mr. President, you have called for the designation of Secretary Aguirre. Did I hear you correctly that this is based on, is it Section 4 of
Section
Republic
4A.
Act? I'm sorry?
Yes, Mr. President, Section 4A.
Of Republic Act 6713 or the Code of Conduct and Ethical Standards for Public Officials. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President.
Now, you know, Mr. President, I have been trying to compare our setup in the Department of Justice and the Secretary of Justice with the Secretary of Justice in the United States. My impression, just based on media reports, is that it would appear that the Secretary of Justice in the United States government enjoys a certain degree of independence from the President. And this is necessarily so because the Secretary of Justice is supposed to uphold the rule of law, prosecute the offenders, and regardless of political affiliation and loyalty, he is supposed, the Secretary of Justice in the United States is supposed to proceed in accordance with how he reads the law. My impression is that in this country, in our system, the Secretary of Justice is being a political appointee, appears to be under the control and supervision of the President, and therefore has no independent judgment insofar as enforcement of the law is concerned. Is that a correct impression, Mr. President?
Unfortunately, Mr. President, past and very recent events would seem to bear that out. I think the situation that the good gentleman pointed out in another country with regards another Secretary of Justice is quite enviable. And yet, Mr. President, during his sponsorship speech of the Code of Conduct for Public Officials, then Senator Rene Saguisa did say, loyalty is something we often hear about these days. But to what is loyalty and to whom is it owed? Public servants in the civilian and military sectors are enjoined and exhorted at all times to uphold the Constitution and to put loyalty to flag and country above loyalty to persons, party, and faction. And I only wish, good gentlemen, that this was observed less in the breach by our own Secretary of Justice here in the Philippines.
Thank you, Senator Hontiveroz. Again, on the topic and the issue of impartiality. In the committee hearings on the killing of Kian de los Santos, this representation has strongly suggested to the Secretary of Justice, Secretary Aguirre, that maybe he should defer to the Ombudsman insofar as the investigation of the killing of Kian de los Santos is concerned, because of the perception of lack of impartiality. We have gone on record and publicly have asked the Secretary of Justice to in effect inhibit himself from this investigation and leave to the Ombudsman the matter of investigating the policemen involved. Given the history, as pointed out by Senator Hontiveroz, of perceptions of partiality. Now, does the good lady senator share this view that we have taken in the course of the committee investigation, and has the good senator suggested the same to the good Secretary of Justice?
Yes, Mr. President. In various fora after the good gentleman aired that view, I expressed that I wholeheartedly share his view that in the spirit and interest of impartiality and the pursuit of justice, I likewise demanded that the Justice Secretary inhibit himself from all investigations being conducted into the killing of Kian. And secondly, Mr. President, I asked the Secretary to cease from offering the 3 witnesses who were then under the protective custody of the Senate and who afterwards, until now, are under the protective custody of the good bishop, to cease offering them to be covered by the Witness Protection Program of the DOJ. Because as the good gentleman from Iloilo also pointed out, after the Secretary's many one-sided statements in Senate hearings and even media interviews, it was plain to see that he had lost all credibility to hear Kian's case. And I repeat here what I've said before, that placing the witnesses in the Secretary's quote-unquote care would have been like delivering sheep into the lion's den, Mr. President.
And I'm interested, how did the Secretary of Justice respond to the good senator on that point?
Well, Mr. President, the Secretary said he had no problem with inhibiting, but that I should also inhibit myself from the Senate probe. At one point, he tagged me as a quote-unquote drama queen for demanding his inhibition, and demanded that I state which cases exactly he has intervened in. There are some I could mention, Mr. President, but as to that drama queen tagging, well, Mr. President, pwede ako sa rom-com, pwede pa sa adventure, pero si Good Secretary hanggang kontrabida lang po, Mr. President.
Maybe he had in mind your being a child protege of Repertory Philippines, where you had a lot of acting roles, Mr. President.
I hope the good Secretary's attitude when he uttered those words was as kind as that of the good gentleman.
By the way, by the way, for the record, who has custody now of these minor children that you have witnesses who are minors? Is it Bishop David?
Yes, Mr. President. After the witnesses were discharged as witnesses of the Senate Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs, after they had testified, then the protective custody of the Senate over them ceased, and they were turned over to the continuing custody of the good Caloocan Bishop Pablo Virgilio David, Mr. President.
Yes. Mr. President, in the course of the speech of the lady, mention was made of former Congressman Jacinto Jing Paras and Attorney Topacio. Just to remind us, can the good senator read again the contents of the messages and exchanges between the good secretary and either Congressman Paras or Attorney Topacio, for the record?
Yes, Mr. President. I will reread here the exchange between Secretary Aguirre and someone named Kong Jing. The Kong Jing said, "Naturuan na ni Hontiveroz yung testigo. Her questions are leading questions." And the Secretary replied, Yun nga sinasabi ko kanina dito, very obvious. Kaya expedite natin ang cases ninyo against her. End of exchange.
So the
Mr.
substance of this is that he was encouraging or in fact or even directing Congressman Paras and Attorney Topacio to expedite the cases against Senator Hontiveroz.
Yes, Mr. President, he was he enjoined Kong Jing to expedite their cases, presumably VACC's cases against me, Mr. President.
And where are the cases supposed to be filed? I assume with the Department of Justice?
Well, that's why, Mr. President, I was so bothered by finding out about this because nagmumukha po talagang lutong Macau. Sabi ko nga po ay nakikipagkuntsabahan siya sa isang grupo na maghain ng kaso laban sa akin, kaso na departamento niya mismo ang magdidesisyon kung may probable cause o hindi at kung tutuluyan ang kaso laban sa akusado. So, napaka-unethical po, Mr. President, at napaka walang pagrespeto dun sa constitutional guarantees on immunity para sa mga mambabatas, Mr. President.
Mr. President, former Congressman Paras and Verdi Topacio, to my knowledge, are members of the legal profession. They're both lawyers, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
Since they are not public officials, what standards would govern their conduct as legal practitioners?
Well, Mr. President, though they are not holding public office as members of the legal profession, they are bound by the Code of Professional Responsibility. And this code applies with equal force to Secretary Aguirre, since Canon 6 specifically states that these canons shall apply to lawyers in government services in the discharge of their tasks. But as this conversation showing connivance clearly shows, Secretary Aguirre and Kong Jing failed to adhere to the Code of Professional Responsibility, particularly Canon 1, Rule 1.02. A lawyer shall not counsel or abet activities aimed at defiance of the law or at lessening confidence in the legal system. Canon 10, Rule 10.01. A lawyer shall not do any falsehood nor consent to the doing of any in court, nor shall he mislead or allow the court to be misled by any artifice. And Canon 12, Rule 12.04, a lawyer shall not unduly delay a case, impede the execution of a judgment, or misuse court processes, Mr. President.
I'm sure, Mr. President, that many lawyers do not know this canon. Ethics is only 2 units in college, but never mind. When you were delivering your speech, the majority leader and I were talking about where to refer the speech. And the majority leader said he has some difficulty trying to figure it out. But I noticed that you moved that for a referral to the Committee on Civil Service. Why would this be to the Civil Service, Mr. President?
I move, Mr. President, for my speech's referral to the Committee on Civil Service primarily, and to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Codes secondarily. To the Committee on Civil Service primarily, Mr. President, because the heart and soul of the speech touches on ethical conduct, or in this case, I'm a very unethical conduct on the part of a public official, on the part of a member of the civil service, Mr. President. And also secondarily to the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Revision of Codes, because in my speech, Mr. President, I also call on our chamber to review if the constitutional guarantees on immunities of legislators are currently sufficiently spelled out so as to afford this guarantee or this privilege to all members of the legislature in the proper conduct of our legislative duties, Mr. President.
Just one final point, and this is concerning the witnesses who are admittedly minors and which gave rise to all these problems that you're bringing to this chamber. By the way, for the record, the witnesses are all minors, Mr. President?
Mr. President, there were 3 witnesses in the Senate's custody, 2 of whom were minors, and the third, the last one, is an adult, Mr. President.
Now, did the parents of the minors consent to your office having custody of these witnesses, for the record?
For the record, Mr. President, yes, with respect to the youngest witness. As to the older but also minor witness, consent was given by her guardians. Her guardians gave consent because her guardians are serving as the de facto guardians since she had been living with their family or with the guardian's family. As for the youngest minor witness, Mr. President, her father delegated her 22-year-old sister to serve as guardian of her sister. Her mother sent a notarized consent for her daughter, the youngest minor, to testify and delegated her sister of legal age as guardian. And the guardian of legal age gave written consent for her minor sibling to testify and granting custody at first to my office and then to the Senate, Mr. President.
So this consent given was in writing and duly notarized?
Yes, Mr. President. All these documents of consent are in writing and duly notarized, including the one sent by the OFW mother from abroad through the Philippine consulate in that country.
Just one final point, just for the record. After you have taken custody of these witnesses pursuant to the written authority or consent, has any agency been denied access to these witnesses?
Never, Mr. President. As I had repeatedly stated, if the public attorney's office had wanted to get the testimonies of the witnesses, they were and still are free to do so. In fact, the Commission on Human Rights, the National Bureau of Investigation under the department, and the Office of the Ombudsman have already done so. In fact, the NBI filed a case based on the testimony, the affidavits of the witnesses. The Bureau filed a case in the DOJ, and there are already scheduled 2 hearings in the next weeks, Mr. President. So all agencies who have wanted to get the testimonies of the witnesses and interview them have been free to do so. 3 have already done so, including the NBI of the DOJ. There was no need for anyone to take custody of the witnesses just in order to get their testimonies, Mr. President, and cases are already filed based on these testimonies of the witnesses, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Hontiveroz. Thank you very much for spreading to the record those vital information. We no longer have questions, Mr. President, and we thank Senator Hontiveroz for yielding the floor for those clarificatory questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the good minority leader.
Mr. President,
Would the distinguished lady restate the motion she made earlier?
Yes, Mr. President.
Mr. President, before she does that, if you do not mind, then she will not mind. I will first confirm what the minority leader said concerning the predicament that I was in. As a matter of fact, I was voicing it with him. And initially, we were discussing public accountability, perhaps justice. Now, the distinguished lady was putting forth a motion that was not restated yet, which is the Committee on Civil Service and Committee on Constitutional Amendments, so that we do not be misinterpreted. May I move that her motion or her proposal be referred first to the Committee on Rules? I promise to report it out as early as tomorrow, Mr. President, just to make sure that we're not crossing any points on the issues raised, Mr. President.
What is the response of the distinguished lady to the appeal of the majority leader?
Mr. President, with the assurance of the good majority leader to refer my speech soonest to the appropriate committees according to the Committee on Rules, I yield to the wisdom of the majority leader, Mr. President.
Majority leader, there is no objection from the gentle lady.
Yeah, if there is no objection, Mr. President, I restate the motion that the privilege speech, the entire privilege speech, be referred to the Committee on Rules with the assurance that the Rules Committee will report it out tomorrow.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last September 6, the Chamber approved on second reading Senate Bill 909 under Committee Report number 77. This is the bill on illegal gambling activities.
Yan ang privilege speech ni Senadora Risa Hontiveroz sa Senado. Pinapababa niya sa pwesto si Justice Secretary Vitaliano Aguirre dahil nakikipagkuntsabahan umano siya sa isang grupo para magsamparaw ng kaso laban sa mga miyembro ng oposisyon. Wala rin daw kredibilidad si Aguirre na hawakan ang kaso ni Kian de los Santos. Sinusubukan pa naming kunin ang reaksyon ni Secretary Aguirre.